Hello, everybody. First, thanks to everybody for their engagement in that first talk. It's great to see so many people asking questions. Great to see so many familiar names there too. It's been a great start to the day, and we've got another really great talk lined up for you now, which is evolving global illumination in Overwatch 2. I'll introduce our speaker. It's Will Pierce. He's a senior software engineer too at Blizzard Entertainment. He's been with Blizzard on the Overwatch team since 2020, has over 16 years of experience as a software engineer. Will has spent his time at Blizzard building and improving rendering features for Overwatch and Overwatch 2, including surface deformation, volumetric effects, new BRDFs, temporal super resolution, and global illumination, while also supporting a live service game. Let's listen to the talk.
Hello, welcome to our talk on evolving global illumination in Overwatch 2. My name is Will Pierce, and I'm a senior graphics programmer on Team 4 at Blizzard. Overwatch 2 is a competitive first-person team-based shooter featuring a large roster of unique heroes and a wide variety of maps from all over the globe. Each map can in turn have multiple lighting scenarios such as day, night, dusk, and dawn. This talk will be about our approach to updating the diffuse global illumination solution in Overwatch 2 to a more modern approach while maintaining our previous solution in support of existing maps. This won't be a code-heavy talk, but instead we'll focus on the experiences and processes we've employed along the way. We'll go over the alternatives we evaluated, how we prototyped ideas, gathered meaningful data to help de-risk our major concerns, and finally made it to production. We'll talk about the hows and whys, as well as go over the successes and challenges we've encountered during this endeavor. We'll wrap up by talking about the road ahead and what's left to accomplish. Of note, you're seeing this at an interesting time. We're currently towards the middle of our journey to a full GI replacement. The solution presented in this talk is shipping in several maps, but as you'll learn, we still have work to do before we can call the feature complete. Our current GI solution uses a tool called Enlighten. Enlighten provides a mix between baked light maps for static geometry and baked probes for dynamic objects. As mentioned in our stated goals, one of the primary reasons we decided to evaluate other GI solutions was to improve artist workflows and iteration times. While Enlighten generally has very nice final results, long lighting bake times and the creation of lighting target meshes both act as burdens to our artists. Target meshes are additional mesh types that must be handmade by our artists in Maya that represent simplified versions of our render mesh geometry. This adds an additional time and effort burden on our artists. On this slide, you can see the render mesh geometry on the left as it would appear in-game. On the right is a debug view showing the target mesh geometry. This geometry acts as the input to Enlighten's baking process. Enlighten does also support using the source mesh as an input, but there are a few good reasons to choose target meshes over them. First, target meshes result in fewer light map UV islands than the auto unwrap solutions. This means fewer seams in the lighting and less memory needed for light maps. Target meshes also give artists control over where light map seams are placed. There are also fewer overall polygons sent to the baker, which results in faster turnaround times for bakes. It's worth providing a bit more information about how Enlighten itself works, since as you'll soon see, we're still leveraging some of its data outputs for our new solution. Enlighten works by decomposing the static geometry of the scene into small surface patches referred to as clusters. The target meshes you just saw are what we use as the input for this step. Each cluster contains random points along its surface called dusters that are used to compute direct lighting for the cluster. Enlighten then calculates visibility between each cluster and determines the portion of energy that can travel directly from one cluster to another. All of this data is finally turned into an optimized runtime format. This is a lengthy process that must be redone anytime the static geometry is updated. The trade-off is that it's fast to evaluate at runtime. The image on this slide shows a debug view of just clusters on the left, then clusters with their dusters on the right. Here on the left, you can see a debug view showing the Enlightened cluster data for the scene shown at the bottom. On the right, the clusters are shown being drawn alongside the render mesh geometry. Notice that many objects are greatly simplified, such as the tree and the large entryway, while other objects are not represented at all, such as the statue. So let's look at a few alternatives we evaluated before landing on our current solution. The first and perhaps most obvious approach to improve artist workflows was to see if we could improve the target mesh solution. We explored various ways that this pipeline could be automated. Another member of our team worked with the AI group to see if target meshes could be automatically generated from our render meshes. At the time, however, there was not enough training data available to get usable results. The quality of the generated meshes wasn't sufficient to provide inputs that Enlighten could accurately bake against. We also investigated signed distance field, or SDF, based solutions. Examples of these are what you might find with Lumen in Unreal Engine 5 and SDFGI in Godot 4. While these solutions offer compelling final results, they also seemed a bit complex to fit into our existing pipeline. We also weren't immediately sold on the quality versus performance trade-offs we were seeing. We had limited development resources that could be directed towards this effort. Namely, we had one engineer working on this with a limited amount of time to do it. And with that limited amount of time, we also didn't have an extended window for research. Another solution we found very interesting was DDGI as packaged with NVIDIA's RTX-GI. This is a probe-based solution that includes lighting and visibility data to help alleviate light leaking that's found in traditional probe-based GI implementations. The biggest drawback here was platform support. Using fully dynamic DDGI requires either hardware ray tracing support or at least the ability to run the algorithm in compute shaders as a fallback. Even the compute shader fallback approach is unfortunately not realistic for some of the lower-end platforms we support. But even though we couldn't use the out-of-the-box implementation, we did see a lot of promise here, and that ultimately led us to our current solution. We decided to use DDGI as a baseline for our new approach, but instead of running the algorithm at runtime, we baked the textures ahead of time in tools. Since this is the path we've chosen, I'll give a very brief recap of DDGI here and point to the link at the bottom of this slide for the original paper and a more thorough technical treatment. The idea is to use a 3D grid of regularly spaced probes in world space. At each probe location, you capture radiance and visibility data, then store those to two separate textures. During GI evaluation, you sample the 8 probes that encompass the point in question and interpolate between them to reach your final lighting value. The visibility term associated with each probe is combined with a number of additional weighting terms to help mitigate light leaking through geometry. Since our maps are primarily static, we allow artists to manually place GI volumes and set probe density along each axis as desired. They are also able to orient the volumes in space, which can further help alleviate light leaking and similar issues in tight corridors, stairwells, etc. Being able to manually place volumes and set probe densities provides several levers for controlling areas where extra detail is needed. This offers a trade-off between memory usage and lighting detail. We also allow artists to build hierarchies of GI volumes, nesting multiple child volumes within a larger parent. During our capture process, we blend the last string of probes in a child volume out towards the enclosing probes in the parent volume, providing smoother gradients between higher and lower detailed areas. For each volume, we generate a pair of BC6 compressed textures, one for irradiance and one for visibility. We did also briefly experiment with using BC5 for visibility, but BC6 has the same footprint of 16 bytes per block and allows for 16-bit precision floating point values, which simplified and avoided a lot of quantization logic, so it just seemed like the logical choice. Like the original implementation, we use octahedral mapping to store flattened probes. Probes are stored to a 2D texture array where each slice represents an XZ plane of probes since we use Y as up. Since we can have multiple volumes per map, each generating their own set of textures, it is important for us to keep a close eye on texture memory usage. We have already built some reporting tools to aid with this and have additional tools planned to help make the overall footprint more obvious for artists as they're working. We also build in a basic level of detail system where we can fully omit volumes based on the platform or the player's graphics settings. As a reminder to something that was mentioned earlier on, you're seeing this in the middle of the journey. To get things up and running quickly, we decided to use data that was already available to us. This means leveraging data that our existing Enlighten bakes already produce. Specifically, we use the cluster data that Enlighten outputs as part of its build process for solving irradiance. We use Embry to perform CPU ray tracing of irradiance and visibility against the Enlighten cluster meshes. What this allowed us to do was to bypass having to get our own materials and lighting data into a spot where we could sample and evaluate them on the CPU. This, of course, will not be the solution forever, but it helped move a significant body of work to later in the development pipeline and got us tracing rays and capturing usable data extremely quickly. Ultimately, the reasoning that led us to choosing a DDGI-based approach came down to a few key factors. The first of those is scalability. Overwatch 2 runs on an extremely wide range of platforms and hardware specifications. We run on everything from the highest end PCs to hardware that is well over 10 years old at this point. DDGI's predictable memory footprint and just as importantly, predictable runtime performance cost help set it apart in our minds from the competitors. And remember, for low-end platforms, we can also lot out GI volumes if we were to need to bring the texture memory back down. Another benefit of our approach is that it provides the artist with a workflow they're already familiar with. They already use a placeable volume-based workflow for things like reflection probes and fog volumes, so there's really very little different here when it comes to adding GI volumes to a map. In fact, this is another factor that set DDGI apart from existing probe-based solutions, such as much more finely tuned convex volumes. As seen with target meshes, we were trying to get away from a lot of additional artist intervention, and being able to add a volume to a map that could cover both interiors and exteriors while also not worrying as much about light leaking made DDGI very appealing. Another benefit of our selected approach is that a baked solution is still favorable since our maps use mostly static lighting once a match has begun. We can pre-bake all of our data for each map's various lighting scenarios, then select just the data required for the active time of day during map load. This means we don't need complex update and evaluation logic for indirect lighting, and it can boil down to just a lookup. Now you will notice that there's an asterisk here because the DDGI algorithm is actually 16 texture samples, 8 for the irradiance probes and 8 for the visibility probes, so it is a bit heavier than just a lookup implies, but the indexing logic is quite straightforward and easy enough to reason about. Let's take a brief look at some early comparison images of our Enlighten results versus our DDGI results. In the scene here, the barrels in the corner are dynamic objects. They can be knocked around and moved through the scene, and so are probe lit. With our previous solution, these objects were getting incorrect lighting information from probes that ended up embedded in the walls and floors. You can see how the barrels stand out against the rest of the scene. With our new solution, we can evaluate most objects with per pixel lighting. You'll notice the barrels in the image on the right are now coherent with the rest of the scene. This next image demonstrates a particular asset that was giving our artists a lot of trouble due to bad target mesh data. There's a noticeable odd gradient near the bottom of the fallen tree trunk caused by an unfortunate light map scene. The trunk itself also seems to be a bit darker than the surrounding lighting environment would imply. With DDGI, everything is evaluated the same way. There are no light maps to worry about and therefore no seams causing odd-looking bands on geometry. Again, everything becomes much more coherent. We'll now dive a little more deeply into our process and talk about ideation, experimentation, and determining in practical terms if this solution would actually be a good fit for us. We'll also talk about tackling challenges that were more specific to low-end hardware that we faced along the way. As mentioned before, we support some hardware that's well over 10 years old, and we knew we had some serious work ahead of us to get this running across the board. This slide covers our high-level approach to introducing this new GI solution into our game. We've already discussed the research phase and how we landed on a DDGI-based approach. It was also important to come up with limits early on. Knowing and agreeing on the additional memory and frame time we could afford for a new technique would help keep us honest as we started prototyping and collecting data. It's important to be practical here. It's a hard sell to say build a new and improved thing, and by the way, it can't cost any time whatsoever. Now we'll look a bit at our prototyping process before getting into early data collection to ensure we understood memory and performance impacts. The goal of our initial prototype was to get something up and running as quickly as possible. Primarily, we wanted to get to the real-time evaluation portion of the technique so we could understand runtime performance costs before spending too much time on anything else. For setting up our initial prototype, we landed on one GI volume and one map. The volume used a fixed probe density of 32 by 8 by 32 probes on the X, Y, and Z axes respectively, and was hard-coded to be centered around a specific location in a specific map. We also used this opportunity to ensure we could capture the data we needed and then turn around and apply that data to our lighting pipeline and have it look correct. And in fact, for our initial implementation, we didn't even really trace rays to capture radiance. We instead used the 8 nearest enlightened probes since that data was already available and just linearly interpolated between them to give the probe some lighting information. Remember again that the primary goal here was to get something representative up as quickly as possible. We did do a real visibility trace here since simply testing for occlusion is much easier than evaluating lighting. Then to get something on screen, we just stomped the contents of our light buffer and the first results are what you see on this slide. This was great for our prototyping purposes because now we could start collecting some preliminary data. However, a word of caution, be careful when hacking up a solution like this into your projects because the tech debt collector will come knocking eventually. This slide shows the output textures of our first successful DDGI capture. For those of you familiar with DDGI and octahedral mapping, this probably looks fairly standard. For anyone else, this probably looks like gibberish. But essentially, each square on each texture represents a probe's irradiance or visibility data. We capture irradiance at a resolution of 6 by 6 and visibility at a resolution of 14 by 14. Since each probe has a 1 pixel wide border for bilinear filtering to work properly, the footprint per irradiance probe comes out to be 8 by 8 pixels, and for visibility probes, 16 by 16. We did experiment along the way with reduced resolution for visibility, but as others have seemingly found before us, the quality quickly starts to suffer too much to remain usable. Now that we have our data exporting, we can start verifying some hypotheses. We were fairly certain we had the memory calculations correct because, frankly, they're straightforward to understand, but it's always good to check those assumptions. Uncompressed, each probe should cost 1.5 kilobytes with 1 kilobyte for visibility and 512 bytes for irradiance. Thus, for a volume with 32 by 8 by 32 probes, we had assumed uncompressed memory would clock in at 8 megabytes for visibility and 4 megabytes for irradiance. We were able to quickly confirm these numbers from our exported data, which gave us a baseline to understand how much we could save once we applied compression. As mentioned earlier, we compressed both irradiance and visibility using BC6. Since BC6 outputs 16 bytes per 4x4 block, we can simply look at how many blocks our probes take up and find our expected results. For visibility probes at 16 by 16 pixels per probe, we should end up with 16 blocks. And 16 blocks multiplied by 16 bytes per block gives us 256 bytes per probe. For irradiance probes at 8 by 8 pixels, we get 4 blocks and thus 64 bytes per probe. For our same 32 by 8 by 32 probe volume, we expected to see, and were quickly able to verify, 2 megabytes for the visibility texture and 512 kilobytes for the irradiance texture. Combining those values, we see that we've saved 9.5 megabytes over the uncompressed textures, going from 12 megabytes total down to just 2.5. Obviously, these numbers are much more palatable, especially when you start considering scenarios where a map has multiple GI volumes. Now let's look a bit at our first performance measurements. The image on this slide was obtained from NVIDIA Insight, and the GPU used for capture was a GTX 1080. At full resolution, the DDGI evaluation pass was taking about 330 microseconds. We didn't see this as awful. We knew going in that we would likely need to do some massaging for performance numbers, especially if we were going to support multiple volumes of varying densities. We also figured early on that for this to have a chance of running on lower end hardware, we would probably need to support a half resolution version of the effect. When evaluating at half resolution, we were seeing approximately 115 microseconds on the same hardware. We felt pretty good about meeting our performance goals given the starting point numbers we were getting in our initial tests when gathering data from a discrete desktop GPU. Since this technique would be a replacement for the existing GI solution, we knew we would get some time back in our lighting pipeline where the previous code no longer needed to execute. We felt fairly confident that we could pretty much make up any remaining difference. But then we started gathering data on our low-end targets, and those numbers were not as promising. The initial performance captures from the switch were truly disheartening. We were seeing almost 8 milliseconds of additional frame time, even when accounting for the removal of the existing GI solution. Sure, we had planned on optimization passes to get performance back, but to even get back to the same ballpark as before from that wide of a deficit seemed out of reach. For context, 10 milliseconds is a third of our entire frame budget for Switch. And to be clear, none of this is the Switch's fault, nor intended to drag it down. It has never claimed to be top-of-the-line hardware. We chose to pursue this technique, and so it would be on us to figure out if it's truly suitable across all of our platforms or not. And in fairness, our low-end PC spec, and to an extent the other previous generation consoles also showed challenging numbers, but none were quite so drastic as this. I would say if there was any point where we started to doubt viability, this was it. Fortunately, we're stubborn graphics programmers and don't know when to quit. The first and perhaps most obvious thing to do was, of course, to evaluate the effect at a lower resolution. Moving down to half resolution and fully replacing our previous GI code got us down to a deficit of only about 3 milliseconds. We did look into evaluating lighting at quarter resolution as well, but the quality began to degrade too much to be acceptable. So now we understand what we're up against, and we can start digging into finding more ways to gain additional time back. The location on this slide, by the way, just shows the point in the map where all of our performance data was captured from. We chose it because it represents a worst-case scenario where every pixel is part of a surface and thus needs to receive indirect lighting. We went through lots of optimizations trying to find ways to get time back. This slide shows a non-exhaustive list of some of the larger wins we found. These are referred to here as low-end specific, mostly because that was the driving force behind delving into this work. But they of course didn't make mid or high-end targets any worse, though sometimes the impacts were negligible. Moving from an RGBA16 float texture format to an RG11B10 float format for the evaluation render target was an easy update that helped gain a little time back. A surprising switch-specific boost we found was that by separating the visibility and irradiance evaluation into separate loops, there was a fairly substantial gain. The reference implementation evaluates both terms in a single loop, then normalizes the final irradiance term afterwards. But we found that the texture cache access for switch specifically seems to be more in tune with this setup. Other platforms performed about the same regardless of how the loops were set up, so we kept it enabled for everything to avoid having to support separate code paths. The DDGI shader was still very obviously texture fetch bound, and we were starting to exhaust our options for finding additional time back from that particular shader. We decided to experiment with enabling 16-bit types in our switch shaders. We updated the DDGI shader and a handful of other shaders, for example, a few of our post-processing effects, to use 16-bit types for calculations. There were limited gains to be had in our DDGI shader, since again it was texture bound, but we found that when applied judiciously at certain other points in our pipeline, we were able to recover a few hundred microseconds overall. So the takeaway here is that enabling 16-bit types is not a silver bullet, and it's still important to measure and understand where it makes sense to pursue. I will also apologize for the lack of firm numbers here. Unfortunately, some of the gritty details have been lost to time. But as a general measure, most of these yielded gains on the order of magnitude of high tens to low hundreds of microseconds. Another texture access optimization that did end up being helpful for the switch was to make a slight update to the order the probes were read to be evaluated. The reference implementation processes probe contributions in XYZ order, which makes total sense and is very readable. The way the textures are accessed with that setup, though, is that the x-axis neighbor probe gets read first, then we move to another slice of the texture array to get the next two probes, then back to the original slice for the z neighbors, then back to the other slice for the last two z probes. If you have a good sized texture cache, this is likely just fine. But for switch specifically, we found an improvement to texture cache hits by reordering the loop to read all probes per slice first. Since each texture array slice represents a slab of probes stacked vertically, we first read all the neighbor probes on the XZ plane, then bump to the neighboring probes on the next slice to read the remaining probes. For platforms with larger texture caches, we didn't really see much or any difference, but there was a measurable gain on switch from swapping the access order here. With the previously discussed optimizations, and a handful of others I'm sure I've since forgotten, we were finally back on par with our baseline. As a reminder, our performance testing setup was a single GI volume with the camera set to capture a view where the G buffer would be full so we could understand the worst case scenario. But what we need is to render multiple volumes, and with the way things were set up at this point, it felt like we were going to have a nearly linear cost associated with rendering each additional instance. We did first do a small detour, though, and cleaned up a lot of the terrible hacks and crimes against rendering that we had been getting away with up to this point. With the performance numbers looking favorable and what we thought were solid ideas in our minds to solve the multiple volumes cost issues, this seemed like a good point to fully integrate our DDGI solution into our engine and tools proper. We added the ability to create and place multiple volumes, nest child volumes within parents, and capture and do volume blending into our tools and data pipelines. We also taught our maps about these new types and created a much cleaner custom lighting path for maps that include DDGI as their GI solution. The basic rundown is that our maps are created with things we call placeables, which have basic type identifier information. Placeables get grouped together at map build time, and when it comes time to load a map in-game, we can process all of a type at once. So here, all we needed to understand was whether a map has diffuse GI volumes, and if so, we can set a flag to take our new render path during lighting. Otherwise, all the previous GI solution logic remains untouched and functioning as expected. To that end, our maps only support one or the other. If DDGI volumes are found, that will be what the map understands to be its GI solution. Otherwise, they will continue to use light maps. With our hacks cleaned up and a significantly easier workflow to add diffuse GI volumes to our maps, we could get back to prototyping. We made a hypothesis about what we would see when we started adding multiple volumes to maps, namely that the cost would be somewhat linear, with considerations made for how large each volume was in screen space. Once we had the ability to easily add multiple volumes to a map, we were able to quickly verify our assumptions on what performance would look like. We of course culled volumes that were completely outside of the view frustum, but we otherwise used a quite naive, or you might say outright silly, approach of drawing volumes largest to smallest. We drew them like this because child volumes must fit entirely within their parent, and their purpose is to add detail, so we always wanted their content to be what would win and end up as the final color for an evaluated surface. It was also dead simple to draw them like this because child volumes could just stomp any content written into the GI render target before them. But of course, this is a ridiculous amount of wasted work and overdraw. I'll ask that you not judge us too harshly here. This approach was never the long-term plan. But remember, for prototyping, we want it to get things up and running rapidly, and writing a for loop that runs through volumes stomping the previous contents is about as simple as it comes. So we know what we started with, volumes being drawn largest to smallest, with each smaller, more detailed volume stomping the previous draw. But what we would ideally have is all of our volumes being drawn in the reverse order and indicating which pixels they've touched, so we only pay for each evaluation once. I have a running joke every year that all I want for Christmas is one more stencil bit. Fortunately, in this case, we have a few bits that are reserved for special purposes, and it happened that we had enough space to commandeer what we needed since they were not being used at this point in the frame. We use two bits here, one for marking the currently drawing volume, which we'll refer to as current, and one for marking any pixel that has ever been drawn by a volume, which we'll refer to as any. We first draw the volume with a very simple pixel shader. This pixel shader stencil tests against the any bit and rejects the volume if set. If the pixel is outside the bounds of the volume, we discard it. Otherwise, we set the current bit. Next, we draw the volume with the full evaluation shader. This time, we test against the current bit and only accept pixels where that bit is set. The stencil state is set up so that for pixels that pass, the any bit will be set and the current bit will be cleared. Since this pass does not use shader discard instructions, we can enforce an early stencil test with the early depth stencil shader attribute. With those changes, we can draw volumes in our preferred order of smallest to largest and can ensure that each pixel is being evaluated a maximum of once for the expense of GI evaluation. The stencil fill draws are very cheap. Even on low end, they are usually single-digit microseconds, and on high end, they are maybe a couple hundred nanoseconds. We're now able to observe the draw time of a single volume spread out across multiple volumes and can verify that the combined time does not exceed the single volume case. And there's actually still one more way we can get a little bit of time back. Even though it's already very cheap to draw the stencil volumes, we don't want to waste work if we can help it. We use different depth tests based on whether we're inside or outside of a volume when it's being drawn. When drawing a volume from the inside, the depth test will reject geometry outside the box for us, which is what we use discard for in our stencil fill pass. So in this case, we can actually skip the stencil fill pass altogether. We just go ahead and draw the volume once with the evaluation shader, but instead of looking for the current bit, we just reject if the any bit is set, which you may remember is the test we use in our stencil fill pass. For pixels that pass the depth and stencil tests, we continue to write the any bit just like we were already doing. An interesting thing that falls out of this is that if you're in an interior, you might end up filling your entire stencil buffer on the very first volume, and every other volume just gets rejected downstream. For some of you watching, this may be old hat, but for anyone who may be new or unfamiliar with stencil testing, I'll show two brief examples of how this works in practice. In the scene shown on this slide, there are three GI volumes. There is a small volume inside the room in front of the camera, a second medium-sized volume that encompasses most of the playable space, and then a much larger low-density volume encompassing the rest of the map and background. In this slide and the ones to follow, we're drawing volumes as simple boxes. Red pixels indicate a rejection, while green pixels indicate a pass. You can ignore the purple patches in all of these images. We're just reusing a texture from an earlier portion of the frame here, but those won't make it into the final result. Since we're starting outside of the smallest volume, we'll do the stencil fill pass for that one. On the left are the results of the depth test, and on the right, the results of the stencil test. And remember, we do a manual discard in the shader if we detect a pixel is not contained inside the volume. This pass will set the current bit for non-discarded pixels that otherwise pass the depth and stencil tests. Here are the pixels that pass stencil when we do the actual evaluation of GI inside the room. Notice the back doorways were rejected due to our shader discard. This pass is reading the current stencil bit and only draws where it has been set, and the pass ends by clearing the current bit and setting the any bit. The next volume is large enough that the camera is inside it, so we can skip the stencil fill pass. Notice that the interior of the room is stenciled out, but now the area behind the room will receive its GI evaluation. This pass will set the any bit for all relevant pixels. And finally, our global volume has no actual work to do since everything has been evaluated and stenciled out at this point. We'll go through one more very quick example to show what happens if you start inside a volume. This is the same view from before, we've just moved the camera into the room. This time, we can skip the stencil fill pass for the first volume since the camera starts inside of it. Notice that the depth test is rejecting geometry outside of the volume, so everything beyond the doorways is being ignored. When we go up to the next volume, there's very little work left to do. And once again, we see that our global volume has no work to do at all. With our performance looking favorable across all platforms, it was time to switch our focus to improving quality. For higher-end hardware, we can simply evaluate GI per pixel at full resolution. This yields great results with very little to complain about. For mid and low-range hardware, we need to evaluate GI at half resolution and then upsample the result. We started with just a naive bilinear upsample to get something on screen quickly, but we knew we would need something nicer for shipping. And just as a point of clarification, anytime we say half resolution, what we really mean is half on each axis, so 1/4 of the full resolution pixels. So when you take that low resolution texture and apply it with a basic bilinear upsample during lighting, you get this hot mess. It gets worse the longer you stare at it and is nauseating to see in motion. Obviously, we're not going to ship this. We experimented with a few simpler upsample techniques first. Bilinear is where we started, but was always intended to be replaced. We just saw a compelling reason why it was not really a serious option. Updating to a bilateral upsample that took depth and surface information into account offered a noticeable improvement over bilinear. Unfortunately, there were still too many objectionable artifacts for us to deem it shippable. We also experimented with extending the bilateral approach and taking multiple samples around the pixel being reconstructed, trying to reason about what the results should be based on neighboring information. This offered a bit of a quality improvement over the baseline bilateral implementation, but still wasn't quite where we wanted it to be quality-wise. On top of that, this was quite a bit more expensive than simple bilateral, since now we had additional samples and logic in the shader. We started digging into a temporal solution where we could accumulate a full resolution image over time using existing data. We felt a temporal solution would be a good fit due to the low frequency nature of diffuse illumination. Even in traditionally tough cases for temporal techniques, it should be difficult to spot artifacts like ghosting when the spatial changes are so small. This approach would allow us to keep all the expensive evaluation stuff at low resolution and then combine those results with a full resolution temporal accumulation texture. We weight new samples based on a number of criteria such as depth deltas, disocclusion, luma, and distance moved in screen space. The main issue we needed to overcome with a temporal solution is that we don't generate motion vectors on the platforms that need it most. To tackle this, we decided for these platforms to evaluate dynamic objects using spherical harmonics. This was something we had already started implementing as our solution for things like particles and effects, so fortunately there wasn't a huge shift to add support here. Early in the frame, we fire off a compute shader to calculate coefficients for dynamic objects, and the results are ready by the time we need them in the lighting pass. We use the DDGI inputs to calculate the coefficients for each object, which keeps the lighting results coherent when they're evaluated. This also provides us with an additional early out in the evaluation shader since we know which pixels represent dynamic objects. For static objects, we can just use the camera motion to calculate motion vectors on the fly. At this point, I would like to say a special thank you to our graphics lead, Bruce, who stepped in and helped implement a ton of the temporal stuff. Here is a side-by-side comparison of the same scene with our full resolution evaluation on the left and our half resolution evaluation on the right. Notice how even in the corners and near depth discontinuities, the half resolution temporal upsample holds up well and the ugly artifacts we saw with bilinear are mitigated. I'll show larger versions of these images on the next two slides for easier comparison. If you focus on the cracks between the bricks near the right side of the screen, you may be able to spot a bit of difference. It's also worth mentioning that the curtains in the background are dynamic objects. This means that they are evaluated per pixel at full resolution and using spherical harmonics at half resolution. Here's a larger version of the full resolution result and the half resolution with temporal upsample result. And the full resolution one more time, and the half resolution one more time. Once we were confident with our overall performance and quality across all platforms, it was time to start looking at getting this into production. Remember that all along this journey, we have also needed to maintain our existing GI solution, and that has not changed. We don't want to ship a new feature of this size and reach and have everything come crashing down. We needed to carefully consider and right-size our approach to be pragmatic about rollout. Overwatch 2's seasonal content model ended up lending itself well to this endeavor. Our first map to receive any of the new GI solution was our Hero Gallery map for reasons we'll discuss shortly. We rolled this out in our Season 13 update. The original plan was to only enable the GI system for dynamic objects, but we decided to push ourselves a little and decided to enable it for static objects as well on high-end platforms, meaning current generation consoles and PC high graphics settings and above. In our Season 14 update, we enabled the new system for everything, static and dynamic, across all platforms. We also updated several more maps to use the new GI solution in Season 14, which we'll also take a look at shortly. Now that we were updating real maps to use our DDGI-based solution, it was a good time to look at actual numbers and ensure our estimates were reasonably accurate. We of course knew what to expect in controlled scenarios, but now we could understand how this translates to production maps. As mentioned before, the first map we shipped with the new GI solution was our Hero Gallery map in Season 13. With this being a brand new system, we wanted to do a controlled rollout where we could account for as many external factors as possible. We saw the Hero Gallery as a good candidate because it's a small map, it gets lots of use. This is the map that's loaded when inspecting hero cosmetics like skins and emotes. And there's a limited amount of stuff going on, which gives us a lower surface area for unexpected performance or quality issues. This slide shows some before and after memory footprint numbers. The main values of interest here are the probe set value, which represents the enlightened probe set memory, and the DDGI probes value, which of course represents the new system's footprint. For this map, we were able to save a fair amount of memory over the previous solution with comparable results. You may also notice that the enlightened probe set memory doesn't read 0 in our after comparison. This is because for now we still keep a very small number of those probes as a fallback in case we miss updating something in the pipeline. This way those missed paths would still get some amount of GI, albeit very low resolution, rather than rendering with no ambient at all. Another important thing to note here is the Atlas and UV memory values. Atlas represents our light map memory, which ultimately can be fully removed since maps only use one technique at a time. UVs represent a combination of our light map UVs and our baked AO UVs. This value can effectively be halved since we'll ultimately only want to load our baked AO UVs for maps that enable DDGI. The next map we updated to the new GI solution for Season 14 was one of our free-for-all maps called Chateau. This map is a bit larger than the Hero Gallery and also has a more extensive interior, including a basement section. Perhaps most importantly, players can play real matches on this map, so we can monitor performance as chaos ensues. In the image as shown, you can see that the DDGI probe's memory has grown in comparison to the smaller map, but is still coming in under the previous probe set's memory, even before we consider discarding the Atlas and UV memory. From our initial observations, we felt pretty good about how things were shaping up and decided instead of just releasing an updated Chateau in Season 14, that we would push ourselves and test the new solution in several more of our free-for-all maps. Much of the same reasoning applied here. These are smaller maps than our typical PvP maps, but still have interesting mixes of interiors, exteriors, and lighting complexities. By and large, we saw our memory gains hold up across all scenarios. We were usually at or under the previous probe set memory, save for a few cases. And once the Atlas and UV data is accounted for, we were always below our previous thresholds. This is probably where we moved from crawl to walk, as we were gaining more confidence in this solution and its larger viability. For our Season 15 content update, we wanted to fully test out our new GI solution in larger PvP maps. We decided to update both of our Clash game mode maps, Hanaoka and Throne of Anubis. There was an inflection point here, where once we had updated the maps to include sufficient volumes and densities to get the detail and quality we wanted, we were over the initial probe set memory by a few megabytes. But again, once Atlas and UV memory is reclaimed, we're back to being comfortably below our starting point in both cases. And perhaps just as importantly, even with the additional memory, we were still under our overall lighting budgets for the maps. Let's now look at our performance numbers in production. We'll start by looking at Xbox One and Switch since they are our lowest powered consoles, though PS4 numbers are very similar to Xbox One. The Switch numbers aren't great at first glance, but we have a 30 frame per second target there, so overall we're comfortable with where we landed. And importantly to remember, those numbers are not just tacked on to our existing frame time. Remember, we spent time optimizing other parts of the pipeline as well to get time back, and also replace the existing GI evaluation code when our new solution is active. The true penalty value for where we started for Switch is closer to 1 millisecond, and for Xbox One is closer to around half a millisecond. On our high-end platforms, the overall penalty value is small enough in most cases to be considered noise. Our lowest-end PC hardware specs typically fall somewhere between the Switch and Xbox One capability-wise, so those numbers are typically similar to what we see there. An interesting thing to note for our high-end PC platforms and current generation consoles is that since we evaluate GI per pixel at full resolution, we can of course entirely skip the temporal upsample, so only pay for the cost of rendering the volumes themselves. Also of note is that these numbers all represent the worst case scenario where the entire G buffer is full of pixels that need to be evaluated. They start to drop off fast as you have more sky and background in view. With several full seasons worth of production data and fixes under our belt, we finally felt ready to run. And if you guessed that there was perhaps an additional impetus behind this undertaking, you were right. In Season 16, we launched our brand new game mode, Stadium. Stadium launched with 9 new maps, with each map featuring multiple times of day at release. We wanted this release to be the inflection point where we fully use our new GI solution for all new maps going forward. To meet deadlines for Season 16 and all future Stadium content releases, artists would need an improved workflow that allowed them to iterate more quickly. We'll touch more on the topic of artist workflow in a bit, as it's a portion of the journey where we're still in the walk phase. But being confident in our runtime implementation, we were able to meet our goal and ship all Stadium maps with our new DDGI-based solution. Here's a small collection of images showing some of our new Stadium maps during different times of day. Here we have our Rome and Paris maps. And here we have our dam and arena maps. Before wrapping up, we should take a brief detour to talk about debugging utilities. It is incredibly important when building a new system of any size and complexity to have some form of debugging available. This can include any combination of debug views, metric reporting, value observation, or anything else that's useful in understanding what's happening in the system at a particular time. Do yourself a favor and build these early and alongside everything else. I assure you, you will want to have them before you actually need them. This slide shows a few of the debug views we built early on to support our new GI solution. On the top left, the scene is shown using default rendering. To the right of that image, you can see the ambient light view, which shows just the lighting that DDGI contributes to the frame. The bottom left shows the probes in their world space positions. Each probe is colored with its irradiance data based on direction. The bottom right shows the probes in world space again, but this time with their visibility information. Here, a brighter probe indicates better visibility, while a darker probe signifies worse visibility. When a probe sees too many backfaces, for example when it lands inside a wall or floor, it will be entirely black. This is another super useful tool that another one of our engineers, Marco, worked on as part of some ray tracing work he was doing. The little window shows the world we ray trace against with Embry. For DDGI, this is the data we use for capturing visibility. In this view, red means a front face hit and blue means a back face hit. This turned out to be an invaluable tool when trying to figure out why a probe that seemed like it should have good visibility was actually reading poorly. We found several instances of exterior geometry erroneously poking into rooms and wreaking havoc with probe visibility. This geometry was of course invisible in a normal render view since backfaces are cold there, but the probes would see the backfaces and decide they were poor candidates for lighting, leading to odd artifacts in the final result. This tool allowed us to quickly identify those locations and get our art friends to make touch-ups where needed. Alright, let's recap what's gone well so far. First, we met our goal of shipping all new Stadium maps with our new GI solution. So far, our maps are even with or below their previous GI memory footprints. Our high-end performance numbers look excellent, and our low-end platforms are within the bounds we set for ourselves at the start. We're now getting consistent results with global illumination, regardless of whether the object being drawn is static or dynamic. We no longer have to deal with odd light map seams or worry about dynamic objects pulling incorrect data from bad probe candidates. We've also improved artist workflows in a number of ways. For maps that are built to use DDGI from the start, artists no longer need to create lighting target meshes alongside scene geometry render meshes. And the workflow of placing volumes is one they are already familiar with from reflection probes and fog volumes. Another triumph we'll partially claim is improved bake times, though we are going to revisit this a few slides from now. Our bake times with Enlighten could take between 30 minutes to well over an hour depending on a number of factors such as map size, complexity, and the number of lighting scenarios. We run those bakes distributed across several machines to help speed up the process. Bake times for DDGI generally top out at a handful of minutes, even for complex maps. This is fast enough to be run locally without having to send data up to the build farm, then wait for it to become ready. We could probably still speed this up a bit by, for example, capturing one lighting scenario locally and another distributed, but so far running locally has proven sufficient. And we'll talk in a bit also about future plans to make this process even faster. We do still have some challenges ahead of us. As mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, we're still in the middle of our journey for a full GI replacement. The first challenge we face is low-end performance. While we're not unhappy with our current numbers, we feel they could be a little better, and we are still actively investigating to see how we might get a little more frame time back. DDGI itself has a few shortcomings that present new challenges that we didn't usually face with light maps. The first and main challenge is that even with the visibility data, there can still be light leaking in some areas. Usually this is due to some combination of probe spacing and/or thin geometry. We have to find a balance between solving every case and using more memory with child volumes to cover tricky areas. One of the best solutions here, though, is to work directly with artists and encourage them to use thicker walls, ceilings, floors, etc. Since our visibility data is stored in the first two channels of a BC6 texture, we also have one free channel that we're experimenting with to see if there's useful additional data we can pack there. Because we're doing our ray tracing on the CPU, baking our DDGI probe data can still take a few minutes, which is something we think we can improve upon. Also, the results from our DDGI capture can look a bit different from our lightmap bakes. The reason for this is pretty simple. We're solving GI in space around surfaces rather than directly along the surface. But this one gets an asterisk because, as we've seen, sometimes the lightmap bake gets things wrong as well. So we could actually be getting a correct result from our new process that just looks different from what we were previously outputting. There are still some cases where debugging can be a challenge. Having thousands of probes firing thousands of rays each can make isolating a specific problem area difficult. We've shown and talked about a few of the debug tools we have already built, and we're continuing to work on building useful visualizers and other tools as we continue to develop the feature. And finally, our current biggest challenge is the state of artist workflows. While we have improved some aspects of the workflow, some others are temporarily worse. To meet deadlines for shipping, we had to first focus on getting the runtime portion to as good a state as possible before focusing as much effort on the authoring side. The two biggest current drawbacks both come from how we're getting our irradiance data. Since we're still using Enlighten cluster data to do our irradiance ray trace against, artists still need to do an Enlighten bake to generate that data in the first place. Now, those bakes are faster than they were previously, since we now bake a significantly smaller number of Enlighten probes as part of that process, but they can still take 10 to 20 minutes depending on the map. Basically, this means that bake times in practice haven't improved as dramatically as we'd like them to yet. Another obstacle we currently have is that artists are not able to see immediate results from lighting changes until they recapture the DDGI textures. Again, this is something we'll want to rectify for them. With our discussion of challenges, in particular the ones we're imposing on our artists, it's probably a good time to mention just how important it is to keep your users on board from the start during a major feature shift like this. As soon as we were confident in our prototype, we had a big meeting with our artists to introduce them to the new system. We showed off a few maps using DDGI, showed before and after comparisons, and also provided them with an experimental build with the feature enabled so they could see the results firsthand. We used this time, of course, to discuss all the ways this new approach could improve things, but we were also upfront about the drawbacks, even the temporary ones. This also turned out to be a great opportunity to get a first round of feedback. We were able to take the feedback from this meeting and create a prioritized roadmap that anyone can review to see what's been done and what's left to accomplish. We made Jira tasks out of everything we had left to do so anyone on the team can inspect the board to see where we are in the process. Since that initial meeting, we've provided regular incremental updates and progress check-ins when a new feature is added. We also take time to work directly alongside the artists as they're acclimating to the new workflow, A, to help them understand and work with the current state of tooling, and B, to get valuable feedback for anything we perhaps hadn't thought of or ways that we can make their workflow better. The artists are being patient with us with the temporarily worsened workflow, so the least we can do is make sure we're building the final product into what will help them do their job best. Which brings us to looking into the future. Now that we're shipping, we can focus back on our artists and start easing their workflow woes. High in the list of priorities is to re-enable real-time lighting updates in the map editor. Ideally, they should be able to see a good representation of what the results will look like while they're working, then do one real bake for checking in that will more or less just compress the current results to BC6 textures and store them appropriately. We also want to fully move off using Enlighten's data and use our own materials, etc. for lighting. This will remove the need to do a full lighting bake and get us down to baking just the data that DDGI actually needs. Being able to avoid the full lighting bake should offer an additional and considerable speed up to capture times. We also want to experiment with using the GPU to make capture times even faster. Running the out-of-the-box DDGI algorithm on the GPU could take our bake times down from minutes to seconds, which is obviously enormously appealing. One hangup we have here is that our engine is heavily DirectX 11 based, so hardware ray tracing features are not currently available. The good news, though, is that we have a DirectX 12 backend that is currently shipping in beta, so we should be able to revisit this as that continues to develop. From the runtime perspective, now that we have this spatial GI data, we want to explore what else might be interesting to apply it to. An example would be our volumetric fog. Currently, our fog uses a single ambient value, but if we were to update it to read our DDGI data, we could give it some nice spatial variation. Of course, we'll want to remain cognizant of performance here, but this could end up as a high-end feature where our low-range platforms fall back to our existing fog lighting. There is also some exploratory work we'd like to do, time permitting. One example of this is looking into sparse volume representations with the aim of reducing memory from redundant probes in large, low discrepancy spaces, for example, the sky. The perceived trade-off here is between an even better memory footprint and a potential performance impact due to more complex sampling calculations. But like we've discussed already, we shouldn't rely on assumptions. Make your hypothesis, measure before, and measure after. As a final point of interest, this beautiful slide shows a rough timeline of this endeavor from conception to shipping. You'll notice that it's quite sporadic, with large swaths of time going towards other unrelated work. Much of this is a direct result of marching towards ship for Overwatch 2 and then continuing to provide new features, updates, and support for the game and tools once it went live. We won't review each item on this slide, but you can view it at your leisure once the deck is posted online. The main takeaway here is that when implementing a large system in a shipping product, flexibility is key. A sincere thank you to our engineers, artists, QA members, and everyone on Team 4 who has been critical in helping get this technique from concept to production. Nothing we do is accomplished in a vacuum, and everyone here has helped in some way or the other along the way. If you'd like a more thorough treatment of the DDGI algorithm itself, please refer to these excellent resources. Finally, be sure to check out the bonus slides available in the online version of the slide deck. There you will be able to find several additional screenshots showing final results of our new GI solution. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you so much, Will. That was a really great talk. I think it's just a great way of explaining what it's like to make graphics features in production to so many people out there. And we have so many questions for you, so I will just get started with asking them. And I'll try and group some together as well. We have lots on similar themes. Um,
Sure.
the first one is from Henry Allen. How is the visibility between the enlightened clusters calculated?
Yeah, so during the enlightened the enlightened bake, we basically use Embry and fire tons and tons of rays from each surface all over, and we we keep a list of the 256 other best clusters to use for evaluation there. That's the highest impact on like bounce lighting.
Hmm, cool. Thank you. And we have a number of questions for you about the DGGI probe volume placement. I mean, quite a few people have asked this. So
Mhm.
there's one from, is it Elias Caparanis? I can imagine artists having DGI probes being visible all the time so that there is no unfortunate asset placement. And how would you say that affects an artist's workflow and iteration time?
Yeah, so when they're adjusting a volume, like certainly the bounds of the volume are, and they can enable to see the actual representation of the probes themselves. Um, as far as affecting like their workflows and stuff, I think it's useful that it's something they're already used to somewhat. Um, and then like there is probably still a little bit more trial and error than we would like, especially since right now, as mentioned towards the end of the talk, we don't have the real-time lighting enabled just yet. That's something that hopefully very soon we will have, and that'll help it a lot with that. Um, but I think overall, like they're able to fairly quickly get like a representative idea of what things look like, and then decide whether the volume itself needs to be higher density or if they need to add child volumes into it to get more detail for interiors and things of that nature.
Cool. That leads really nicely onto our next question from Benoit Miller. Did you find that you had to limit the number of DGGI volumes used by artists?
So currently, we do not limit the number of volumes. We perhaps should, but actually, one of the one of the things, because this is a work in progress feature, one of the things I'm building right now actually is all is having on screen a memory estimate for the volumes, like every volume in a map, so that as artists are moving things and increasing or decreasing probe density, they can see in real time how much effect that extra row of probes or that extra
Mm,
amount of probes is going to have on the overall memory footprint,
mm,
and use that to um, give them an estimate.
mm. Then on a similar theme, we have another question from Alex Sabarin. And did this need for manual volume placement place a lot of stress on art, and was it a bottleneck for them?
It, I mean, it's certainly different from what they were previously doing with, um, with just baking light maps. There's a couple of things we do to try and help out a little bit with that. So, like if they drag a volume over a large space, that can include exteriors, interiors, and everything in between. We do a little bit of probe nudging during the big process. Like if we notice a probe is like right against a wall, we try to push it
Mm,
out a little bit so that it doesn't
mm,
get those pinch artifacts that some people may be familiar with, who've used this before. And also, if if a probe is inside of geometry, we also try to like nudge it out and then away from the geometry. If it's not going to push it so far that it would like crosstalk between, another probe in that cell.
I think yours, I'll answer this the next question as well with that, which is from Sergey Pozniak, which is how do you manage the light leaking that can still happen with DDGI? Do you have anything extra to add on that, or is it just all the probe nudging you're doing?
No, I mean it's yeah, really it's a combination of like getting the right density or setting a child volume inside of a parent that has the right density. That combined with probe nudging gets us a good bit of the ways. We certainly still have some, and um, like was mentioned, we have that third channel in the BC6, and we want to be careful with that. Notice one of the comments was calling this out also. Like, you can't just like pack in data
Mm,
necessarily and expect to get it exactly what you put in when you compress them. So we want to be careful what's put in there, but it could be interesting to find like some useful heuristic to pack in that channel
mm,
that could also help during the waiting process to say this probe is good, use more of it. This probe is terrible, don't use it. But yeah, that's ongoing research to find out.
awesome. Our next question is from Xavier Neosho. Um, did you struggle with keeping both GI implementations working as the new implementation is selected on a per map basis?
Um, by and large, no. Like the previous implementation, I don't think at any point has not worked all the way through the pipeline.
Mm,
Certainly, there are probably a couple of spots where along the way we realized, well, actually, there may still be some of these, but along the way we missed it. We realized we had missed, covering some specific pass and had to go back and make sure we accounted for those. But typically, those were all specific to the new technique,
mm,
and the previous implementation was fine all the way through.
awesome. Next question is from Adam Savitsky. How did using 16-bit types and shaders help with performance? Doing computations using half floats or just packing data in buffers in 16-bit types?
Yeah, that one it's tough to answer. I think most of the games we saw came from shaders where you can get the data you need into like into registers and then have like a bunch of ALUs like
Mm,
coming like with the DDGI shader, for example. What we saw is that even though we updated it to 16-bit, we weren't seeing very much gain from it because so much of it is just waiting for texture fetch.
yeah.
But in some of our like lighting shaders and even our post-process shaders where you start with a sample and then you
Mm,
do like math or something with those were the ones that gave us more time back because we're not just waiting on data the entire time there. We're actually doing something with it.
mm, awesome. We have a couple of questions on stencil buffers now as well. So
Mhm.
from Justin Schwartz, do the stencil passes reduce light leaking as well? And then from Bruno Obstanica, when using the stencil passes to resolve the GI from different volumes, did you encounter seams or discontinuities at probe volume boundaries?
Yeah, so the stencil volumes themselves don't do a ton to mitigate light leaking. Um, sorry, remind me the second part of that question.
So the second one was about, did you
Oh,
encounter seams or discontinuities at probe volume boundaries due to the stencil buffer?
yes, yes. And I think I just briefly mentioned, we do try and blend the first ring of probes in like a child volume out towards its parent, but you kind of have like two non-ideal situations. One is you could do trilinear, but then you are getting potentially like unideal data from the probe. The other, and this is what we do currently, is when we are blending those, we actually do like something very similar to the DDGI
Mm,
algorithm also and try to weight those. And a lot of times that works out well, but sometimes since it's no longer just a linear interpolation, you can actually still get a bit of a thin seam there.
mm,
And when that happens, we try and identify and mitigate those as best we can, whether that's by moving the volume or changing density so that like when
mm.
you're going from very low density to higher density, you don't have such a fast transition. Um, but sometimes we do our best and hope to hide them with a plan or something.
Yeah. So yeah, is that often are you going back to the art team with some of these things then to adjust geometry or adjust the probe volumes to help mitigate those issues?
Yeah, for sure. We talk with them and like I also like typically help go through the maps and help them out with um try and spot some of those artifacts, mainly from the perspective of I've seen them so long at this point, I can kind of quickly identify them and, and get them on their radar.
Awesome. We are at time. There are loads of questions also on Discord. Be great, Will, if you could answer all those extra people who have I wasn't able to ask their questions. But again,
Mhm.
thank you so much. It was a fantastic talk. I'm sure everyone will give you another big virtual round of applause right now, and we'll see everyone after the break at 10:45 Pacific.
Yeah, thank you so much.